Thank you for joining us this evening. Before moving on, I'd like to say a few words of introduction about Professor David Smith. He's a professor at the Department of Philosophy here at UC Irvine School of Humanities. He received his PhD from Stanford University. He's a notable scholar of Edmund Husserl and European phenomenology. Professor Smith is also an author of several books on this subject. Most notably, here's a few. Husserl, which we read for, what is it? Yeah, the one of those for class. Yeah, one of those. And then there's Phenomenology and Philosophy of the Mind, The Mind World, Essays in Phenomenology and Ontology, Husserl and Intentionality, A Study of Mind, Meaning and Language. And and he's also been an author of a number of articles, including the Stanford Encyclopedia Phenomenology entry, which we used for the class that we took again. Yeah. His research interests include phenomenology, ontology, intentionality, philosophy of mind, and philosophy of language. It's an honor to have him at UCI and today at the Philosophy Club. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor David Smith.
So I thought that our format, how long do you usually like to talk? Because I thought a short presentation and then Q&A can also amplify in the best possible way. Okay, good. Well, I did have a short handout here, and you have, I presented these so that you can see the text of some of the historical figures that lead up to phenomenology. So what I've done in this book on Husserl, Edmund Husserl, title is Husserl, is basically to either pull out or to, as it were, press into Husserl a picture of what phenomenology is supposed to be. So one of the things that I wanted to bring out in the book, by 400 pages of analysis of results of one of the great thinkers of the ages, named Husserl, one of the things I wanted to bring out was that, well, there's a new kid on the block. So in the history of philosophy, we have these different areas of philosophy that take shape, and almost in order of their arising over about 3,000 years. You could probably say ethics maybe kicks off philosophy, what's right and wrong. Logic comes in shortly afterwards because Plato introduces argumentation, the Socratic method, while talking about issues of ethics. And the metaphysics starts to take shape. Well, we don't have the word yet until Aristotle. What's the world about? Plato has your forms and your things that have instantiate the forms. That's more Aristotelian language. So then we wait a couple of thousand years, maybe not quite, and then we get a full-throated epistemology with Descartes. How do we know what the world is? And after that, how do we know, using reason or feeling as well, how we should act, how to pursue ethical concerns after we consider the moral, the metaphysical issues as well. But then, after Descartes, I think Descartes begins to open the door to the discipline of phenomenology, which is the study of consciousness. So we've got morality, we've got logic, we've got reality, we've got knowledge, and consciousness, and the meaning that consciousness carries is its own kind of thing. It's kind of running through all of these things along, but not until about 100 years ago do philosophers really kind of begin to put the pieces together and to propose, here is a discipline within philosophy called phenomenology. So that's what I mean, the new kid on the block. It's only 100 years old. All the others are 300, 500, 1,000, 3,000, like that. So that was a pitch. Now, I used Husserl because of, well, I was, of course, specializing in that, but also he's later in the game, so we've got all the big thinkers that come along and establish these parts. What I suggested in one point, one of the commentators said, oh, so you want to have the Mount Rushmore of philosophers. That's going to include, let's see, Plato, Aristotle, Kant, and Husserl. That's in order to have the fourth, so Plato's kicking things off. Mount Rushmore has four figures up there. So Husserl would then be put on the Mount Rushmore of philosophy later in the game, but that's the way it works. So what's phenomenology about? Well, it's about the subject of consciousness in relation to the world, which we know through meanings, through our own conceptualizations, our perceptual experiences, our formations of meaning, whether by language or by experience without language. That's the way that consciousness works. Well, consciousness of something gets the fancy name of intentionality, which comes from, well, bow and arrows from the Middle Ages. It's a Latin term. Intentio means to aim at something, like in a bow and arrow. And it actually means aiming towards something, well, whether you get there. So Franz Brentano, the Viennese philosopher, started to bring this medieval concept into contemporary philosophy, but also psychology. So Brentano proposed that that we need a new science of psychology, and he began to kick off what we call psychology today. But part of psychology was a more analytical enterprise in the sense that Aristotle analyzed the way things are. And so Brentano conceived of descriptive psychology, which he called also phenomenology. And then Husserl kicked off with a whole lot of 50 years of writing, which we have dealt with in some of the courses that some of you have been had with me. So, one of the interesting features in phenomenology, which also goes back through the ages, is, well, what am I? So, René Descartes asked, what am I? You read the Meditations. How many people have read the Meditations? Most everybody. I use it in almost every course because it's one of the great texts of history and philosophy. So Descartes proposed, well, he did the evil genius part where if there is an evil genius in control of my mind so that everything that I was experiencing is mere appearance, still I'm experiencing it, and then what then am I? Answer, a thinking thing. Thinking in the widest sense of whatever my experiences are, not just I think that Descartes was French or whatever, but whatever the forms of experience might be. So Descartes asked, what am I? And immediately answered then, a thinking thing. That is, a thing with consciousness of the world around us. Well, we didn't have the word consciousness yet, so we had to invent that after Descartes. So, a little bit later, we have David Hume with a famous passage, really practicing phenomenology by any other name, but we don't have the discipline by name. So Hume argued about personal identity in the following way to the following conclusion. Here's a quote. You can read this, but I'll put it on the tape. For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception. So Hume says I can never observe myself in my mind, I can only observe perceptions. Immanuel Kant, a little bit later, says, well, remember the cogito, I think, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. The form I think becomes prominent then in Kant's, as it were, transcendental theory of the mind and the way the mind works. So Kant said, quote, the I think must be able to accompany all my representations. And the bold is written in our translation, which comes from the German. So heavy emphasis, the I think, oh, well, that's the phenomenon that Descartes was bringing to our attention. And this form of I think must be able to accompany all of my representations, that is, my ideas, perceptions, experiences of things in the world. So not only am I aware of something that's flying by, I live with this ravens in our neighborhood, they come to visit, so, they're crows, but you know, raven is much more elegant. Quoth the crow, nevermore, I don't think so, quoth the raven. And off he goes, right? So you know that. So the I think must be able to accompany all of my experiences or representations or presentations in Kant's German. So Edmund Husserl comes on a little bit afterwards with a legacy of Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Hume, Kant, and Brentano. And he invented, or he proposed a new discipline called phenomenology, so he's called the founder of phenomenology. And so he set out in search of the pure I. Remember the I think from Descartes, the I think that the I that Hume couldn't find, and that Kant says, well, it must be able to be present with all of my experiences, the I that thinks must be present. So Husserl takes on the problem of what is the I, the pure I, as he calls it, which philosophers had posited in the spirit of Descartes and Kant. And at first, like Hume, Husserl said, I can't find it when I look into my experience. And then he says, and this is a quote, I have since managed to find it, the pure I. That is, I've learned not to be led astray from a pure grasp of the given through corrupt forms of I-metaphysic. So he thinks that Hume was misled by the metaphysics of the self, the I, and so Husserl is going to find the I in his practice of phenomenology, which is reflection upon our experience as we live it, okay? So, I want to talk about where in the stream of consciousness we find the pure I, and it will go very quickly like this. Well, there's a formal structure of the cogito. For example, in the structure of experience that we might represent as I have on the pages, I think that Husserl was Moravian. I see this circling raven. I will to jump over this stream. So in other words, as Descartes used the verb to think, when I am a thinking thing, any of these verbs that denote mental activity are forms of thinking in that sense, okay? And so these are just examples to say, wherever there's going to be consciousness, there's going to be the I think, as in think such and such, see something, will something, and so on, okay? So in this structure of content, or the content of my consciousness, this is a form of meaning. This is what logicians might study, but we're studying it in our own experience. So in these forms of meaning, then, well, this is where we're going to find the pure I, according to Husserl. So in a picture, which happens to be on the board here, then here I am, I, PWS and my initials, right? In the real world, red-blooded human being, okay? I'm experiencing an experience, act of consciousness in the technical jargon, which is a consciousness of something. It's a raven that's circling over, okay? And intentionality is the name of this relationship of consciousness where I am aware of something, as in seeing the raven circling over me. Now, how does that phenomenon of consciousness of something work? Well, on Husserl's detailed analysis, he's a mathematician first, a logician as it were, then phenomenologist, practicing psychologist in effect with Brentano, then a phenomenologist. And then he kicks off a school of intellectual activity of analyzing structures of consciousness. So what do the structures of consciousness look like? Well, the contents of our experience have a sort of logical structure, the I think. In this case, I see this circling raven. And that's where I, the pure I, am found in the pure contents of consciousness. So as I say in the handout, well, it's this little structure of consciousness which is experienced in every experience according to Descartes, Hume, Kant, and so on. Except that for Hume, he can't find the pure I, and here's where Husserl says, along with Descartes, and here's where it is. A little stronger view than Kant's. Not only must this be able to accompany every experience, but it does. And that's where the I is found. So that's the pure I. Okay, now we're good for Q&A. Okay, sit down for a moment. Wait for your job. Ready?
We get in the round of questions or other topic. Questions? This one? Okay.
Draw out a bit of a distinction between the sort of the I situated in that sort of moment of experience between subject and object or something, and the sort of embodied body, or no, what would you say, embodied human, in the sense of, what do you mean by embodied? Like, because you say that this being bracketed out, is that more just the sort of particularities of experiences and imagination?
Lots of people will object to Descartes' metaphysics in the end because the mind is separated from the body, from the consciousness. And then Husserl seems to be bringing back in the disembodied consciousness as in the form of the subject. But you read Husserl more carefully, and, well, actually, first he describes the way in which I find myself in the world around me. So, well, what are these things doing? What's happening here? Well, I'm in the world, and I am embodied. So I have, in fact, now I'm not just a physical object. I am a physical object. Got some bone, other things going on in here, blood, muscle, brain with blood running through it, we hope. So I am a living human biological organism, which is a physical object of a very special sort. But I'm also a person in a social environment, so I'm a physical object, I'm a living body, a physical body, I'm a living body, I'm a personal body, meaning a person and as a member of a community is the way he's using the word. So I'm all of those things above, but wait, out of that context of my lived social, physical, natural reality emerges my consciousness. So we say it comes out of the brain somehow, and we're not sure how, but it's its own thing. My consciousness is its own thing, not reducible to the physical, even the biological, even the social, historical. It's its own thing. So what happens as I somehow or other form an experience is part of that structure of the experience in the normal case is the I think. And that's where the I, in the relevant sense, what he calls the pure I, comes in. So what's the word bracketing doing? Well, Husserl thought that he'd found this remarkable technique for beginning to focus on consciousness in a way that's different from the way a neuroscientist would, for example. Okay? There's a hippocampus involved, right? Okay? A few more things going on in the brain. Well, that doesn't tell us what consciousness is like yet. We need phenomenology to say what it is we're trying to explain by neuroscience and evolutionary biology and social psychology and so on. So the I that comes up in my experience is the product of all of this stuff, however that works, but that's not what we're talking about yet. That's a different story. That's what Brentano called genetic psychology, the causal origins. But phenomenology is about the thing itself, the experience itself, and that's where we find the pure I as part of the form of conscious experience. So that's a fleet of distinctions. The bracketing notion is the technique, if I put in brackets, as it were, I'm not going to talk about the other parts where my brain is working to produce the consciousness. That's what the brackets mean. After the brackets go up, I don't get to talk about that stuff and describing the phenomenology. Now what do I say? Oh, I see this circling raven, that form of experience, which is a form of ideal meaning, is Husserl's terminology. And I think we understand what that means. It's the structure, the content, with its own form. And the I is part of the subject form of the experience. That's the key thing.
So would you say to say that the thing that's bracketed is the sort of phenomenal surface of the materiality, the behavior of the perceptible body, but the other is the sort of intending ego?
It's the origins that, what's bracketed is the causal roots that give rise to the thing itself, the experience. Okay? And that could be the social world, it could be the biological processes got to have enough blood sugar or you're not going to have this consciousness going, right? But that you're not learning from the experience itself. That's what makes possible the experience itself. So now we're talking about the experience itself, and that's the notion of pure I that he's after. Doesn't mean that I'm not actually embodied out here in the world, which everybody seems to think. It means that here I am, here you are. I'm in an intersubjective world, so you're a whole other group of subjects of consciousness. And a lot of our consciousness, as in communication is in right now, is in this so-called intersubjective interplay between what's in my bubble of consciousness and what's in your bubbles of consciousness. And we share a lot of content, like, well, here we are at UCI. So that's a feature of content that is in the consciousness, in the bubble, as I call it, the bubble of consciousness. Good.
Any other questions?
You're on.
Right there.
Yeah. I guess this question isn't super well formed because I have no idea how to go about even starting answering it. So if we look at the split brain experiments where you have the cut down the middle, it seems like this half can perceive stuff on the other side, left half sees stuff on the right side. It seems like you might be able to argue that you have two eyes in there, both perceiving stuff where they don't really combine at all. So how does that affect our understanding of how we are uncut brains?
Well,
How do those eyes come together?
if we've had that kind of experience, then we have to describe the experience in a different way. Now, the funny thing, I'm an inveterate funster, right? So you said there are two I's with a capital letter I. Well, there's actually two EYE eyes, and as you know, each EYE sends messages to both sides of the brain, and so if the left side of the two eyes, if the left field of vision for the two eyes is taking the information over here, then I consciously experience what I see over there. And I may not see what's over there, depending on how it's this corpus callosum which communicates between the two halves of the brain that causes the split. But in the normal circumstance, there's no feeling of split, as it were. So if I have to feel the split, then something else has happened in the causal origins of the experience. And then we'd like to know what that experience is like. Because there is something it's like, and that's the business of the phenomenology, right?
I feel like you don't feel the split. Like as I'm sitting here, I don't feel a split.
Right,
But
that's
if
right.
there were a split, then there might be like some consciousness here, some consciousness here. And
Indeed. Yeah.
Then, like, I'm not sure how to put these two things together.
Well, then we're going to have to do some hetero phenomenology, which is a philosopher named Dan Dennis who talks about consciousness, but he wants to reduce it or get rid of it sometimes, we think, but let's give him credit. He was at Irvine, by the way, for his job position long before. I thought I was reincarnated Dan Dennett for a while, but and I think actually I reincarnated on another line item of the state budget. That's what we are. We're next to. So Dan Dennett introduced a nice issue of how do we do phenomenology when we're trying to figure out what other people are experiencing, because we do it all the time. Are you doing it now? Are you listening? Are you hearing? You're thinking along with me, right? Okay. So we're communicating. So if we focus on the consciousness that we are sharing while we're talking about waiting for the pizza, then where are we? Where am I? Well, I'm in my experience communicating with you in your experience, and I begin to understand the way in which you are experiencing and thinking, and that's called empathy. And that's a feature of consciousness that I have and that you have and that we all have. And as we begin to share experiences by way of empathy, then we form an intersubjectivity of a collective, well, it has a name right now. It's UCI Philosophy Club, right? So we form a community also with an intersubjective sphere of consciousness. So Dennett's idea was, well, my problem, Dennett says, is with autophenomenology, where you're going to put up the periscope and look around in your mind. It's not the way it's done, Dan, but come over, okay? It's more complicated, but we could also want to ask, can I understand the way your experience works? Well, yeah, that's how we watch each other and we learn in our experience what the others are about. And after a while, we can't quite always separate where does the I leave off from the we, which is cool. That's the world we're in.
Plural subject.
Plural subject is what we want, not a divided body politic, as it were, right? So we want to have, through empathy in the sense of understanding others, well, that's what then hetero phenomenology, what's the experience of the other person like? And so we kind of actually do both, which is kind of nice, right? So, well, Dan didn't know that, but so, I mean, that's fine, that's fair. But he gave us those good words. And by the way, because we do this transfer of ideas and feelings and concepts amongst each other, we understand better our own contents of consciousness, right? So even, what's the raven? Is it any different from a crow? Well, it's got to be a big enough crow. We'll see, I don't know, but I can talk to the biologists and get a little better sense on that, see? So we have concepts that we use together, and that's useful, right? So the method of bracketing then is also something that we could do. Well, we're not talking yet about how the brain does all of this stuff, but here's our experience, and let's get together about what empathy is about, even, for example, like that.
Any more questions?
Oh, you call it up.
So can phenomenology explain or address the question or the concept of attraction?
Oh, attraction?
Attraction to something, maybe any kind of attraction.
Yeah. To ideas or people or
Yes,
or
anything.
beauty in
Why?
the world
Yeah.
or whatever.
Yeah. Why is the I attracted to something, basically?
Phenomenology would be begin to analyze what this kind of attraction is like. And you might start with a very, very simple version of attention, right? So if suddenly I got the attention of, oh, somebody's walking by outside, then that's the beginning of conceptual attraction, emotional attraction, focusing on different parts of the world. So as we kind of analyze different forms of experience, that's what it's all about. So then we go to work and keep on analyzing.
Right.
Make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
Any other questions?
Yes, there are always.
Yeah, so you.
Yeah, so then let's say that I have some conscious experience, and experience has content, and let's say I'm trying to tell you what my experience was like. It feels, I mean, I can write a lot, I can talk to you for hours, but it feels like there's something about my experience that I can't try to come here and tell you what it was like for me to experience that and try to communicate that to you in as many ways as possible. But there's something about, something lacking in the way in which I try to express my experience
Absolutely.
to you.
Yep.
But which if you go outside, just take one look, in 1 second you'll have that experience. But
Right.
even if it may take me hours, but I may not be able to translate my experience to you. So what is it that's distinct about actually having the experience versus trying to express that experience and put it down?
So if phenomenology is the study of conscious experience and trying to analyze different parts of it, part of it is going to be in our experience alone. If we try to communicate with others to sharpen, in fact, beginning to try to explain and articulate, I mean, the arts do this artfully, psychologists do it more theoretically, neuroscientists still in a different way, Well, you got the thalamus a little excited there for a moment there, and I've just learned that there are two streams in the visual processing, and wasn't that fascinating? So I didn't know that the peripheral vision is processed in a different way than the central vision. But that knowledge coming from others, running experiments, helps me to reinforce the description of my own experience, which is kind of interesting. We get to go back and forth. Now, ideally, what we might want to be able to do someday is to have the right sort of brain scan, which instead of virtual reality machines, it'll cause, but once again, cause the arising of a certain form of consciousness in which I experience it. Now, I'm still going to have the same problem of understanding what that consciousness is, and then even trying to explain it to someone else. But if I say, well, I don't have the words, but here, put the headset on. Did you feel that? Did you see that? Did you think that? All the experiences. What did you want to do? You wanted to jump out of the airplane? Oh, wait a minute. You see, it was just a virtual reality experience, but that was what my dream was like, let's say, So we know how to deal with our experiences. We try to explain, articulate, express in whatever ways that we have. And the phenomenological reflection is analyzing what's the best version that we can do to put out what our experience is about. And it's very hard. And look how formal and simple a beginning piece of analysis is, right? But you ought to see those crows, man. See, years ago, I had a crow that would come and sit outside the kitchen while you're, making a coffee or something, and he's literally like a parrot swooped down to visit you. And then he's gone, so I guess he didn't live. But I've got some new crows coming to visit, right? And they're right outside the window in a different frame. And I swear they're kind of talking to me. Crows are really smart, they tell us, right?
Their funerals and everything.
And they even help people sometimes. So that's interesting, right? So anyway, how do I explain this? Well, you kind of got to be there, but we do our best. And here's a piece of formal analysis of what a structure of experience is. There's a subject component, at least most of the time. We'll come back to that. Your job?
Yeah, I had a question about, in this question, where am I? It seems like you're presenting it in a spatial way. So my question is about, what is temporality for Husserl? Or you gave sort of this biographical sketch of the question, what am I? Which is historical, so.
And did move from what am I to where am I?
Yes,
and did you notice there are quotation marks around where am I?
Yeah, so maybe
and
where
did you
am
notice
I?
the angle quotes at the bottom?
In space. Oh. Yeah, I'm just, what would be Husserl's theory of history, right? Because you mentioned that the I would have to do with the intersubjective we.
So, stream of consciousness, that's William James' term of art. He wrote this Principles of Psychology, one of the first real wonderful phenomenological treatises as the foundations of empirical psychology. Much was very phenomenological, 1891. So actually you noticed that, you noted that I went to Stanford, and I just read that in 1904, William James came from Harvard to teach at Stanford, and he left after 1906. I wonder why. The walls came crashing down. They rebuilt these nice sandstone buildings after 1906, after the Accord. So William James, the psychologist, could have brought phenomenology to the West Coast earlier on, because it was only a few years after Husserl had invented the formal discipline. So anyway, lots of phenomenology going on in lots of different ways was where I wanted to go. Now, embodiment. Okay, where am I? Well, on the one hand, my experience says that I am here. So that was part of the pun, right? But the pure I, the living, personal, bodily I, is here. And now it's over here, right? Oh, there's a little flow in time there. So my analysis of time consciousness, William James himself said that the span of the immediate present is about 5 seconds, was the way he put it, the specious present it was called. meaning because the present is really not a knife edge point in time, or is it a long stretch, but it's our lived experience of the present. And as things move along, then stretches of time enter our memory banks rather than our immediate experience. But Husserl's analysis says, but for this stretch of time, I have a very short-term kind of memory, what you call the retention. And you have it too if you're listening to this sentence. You retained the beginning, right? And guess what's coming next? It's going to get around to what I asked, right? So that's the anticipation that's coming. So in this short span of experience, there is a flow of a sense of time. And now in the normal course of events, then I experience myself as living through that span of time. And even if I'm doing something like I am talking with my hands and writing on the board and producing sounds and so on, as I'm doing that, well, that's taking a certain amount of time, but notice I am doing that. So at the level of consciousness, the pure I is stretching through the living present here. Now, wait a while, go to sleep, come back. Oh, hey, you guys are still here, great. Well, my consciousness resumes where I left off in virtue of my memory. And as my memory starts to fade, it's fading a little bit, but still mostly there, right? Then my personal identity, as Locke and Hume, Descartes, Locke, Hume, Kant were worried about, my personal identity continues in virtue of at least my memory. Now that's beyond the phenomenology into the empirical psychology, and nowadays into the cognitive psychology. What parts of the brain are involved in memory, and then in short-term and long-term memory. And with certain kinds of brain damage, either one can be gone, the long or the short can be gone. So certain parts of the brain have to be operative, but that's not the phenomenology. The phenomenology is what's the flow of experience like. Then where am I when I experience myself in the world, when I experience the world around me? That's the fundamental way. I am aware of things around me in the world. The brackets are around the world, but I am experiencing the world, and that experience of the world has me flowing through time like that. So there's my experience, the pure I in there. There's the object of my awareness, which is actually my surrounding world, called my surrounding world, Umwelt in the German, in which, what do you mean surrounding? What's surrounding me? So where am I in that sense? My pure consciousness. So the point of the talk was that my pure consciousness is right here. It's the element of the content of my experience, which I am living through in this moment of experience. That's the pure I. But the living I is the thing that's down in the world. And even the thing that's in the world, in the surrounding world here, is presented in my experience. This circling, what do you mean circling? Circling above me. So even over here, the content of the objects that I'm aware of, still at the level of consciousness, is also related to me. Not emphasizing me, it's rather, I am the locus of the surroundings. And I have to learn that there's other things that go along with, well, it's happening here. So where am I? Oh, of course I'm here. Pun, right? Where am I? Scare quotes, meaning leading into what's the pure I? Well, it's in the form of the experience that is mine, that as I experience. So actually, of course, the word I is doing a whole lot of different work there. And we're starting to distinguish some of these different levels, and that's kind of the point. Make sense?
Yeah, we had a question earlier about how the eye experiences attraction to certain things, and I was thinking. I mean, if we're talking about the pure eye, it's some kind of something that just finds itself having an experience already.
Fair enough.
So, can we really say that it does anything so active as to be attracted, or? is it just entirely passive?
I am drawn to this incredible raven, right? Who's befriending me, I swear, right? So there's a form of experience. There's the pure I, the subject of the experience. So the point is that the pure I is thus the I, it's I in the role of subject of consciousness. You tell me the form of consciousness, and I'll see if the form I is present as it normally is. Kant says it must be able to be present everywhere. Isn't anyone going to ask about the no-self
Oh,
theories?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yeah, well, that's where I was kind of going.
Well, guess what? This form of experience is the norm, as it were, in the sense of how we usually, typically, as more or less adult human beings, in a world more or less like this, experience things, where I see and hear and think and feel and am drawn toward things and do work to get a college degree and whatever I do. I'm the subject of those kinds of experiences, including actions, including motion, moving about, talking, and so on, right? But there are modes of consciousness where I think the pure I, even the pure I, disappears. So in the right source of forms of meditation, we are told, and I think it happens, then the sense of self, of I, just sort of disappears. In which case we have a different form of experience, a different form of consciousness then. So where am I, wherever I'm having this experience, is with a certain kind of self-consciousness, not self-consciousness in our everyday sense, but a form of consciousness which, as it were, emanates from a pure I. But sometimes there isn't a pure I involved, and that's perfectly fine, that's part of the experience. Sometimes we think of when we're intensely engrossed in an activity, then maybe we're trying to fix this camera, right? Then maybe the I sort of recedes at least, and maybe when we're intensely involved in something that's really intricate. So I always think of a watch repairman trying to get the glass and trying to move those tiny little parts around. Better not cough, better not listen to the phone, better be paying attention to what he's doing. Or if you're a surgeon, right, you better be paying real close attention to what you're doing. And then, to what extent is the I present? Well, usually I think it is, but sometimes there are forms of experience where maybe you could argue that the most intense forms of attention require that we sort of let go of that normal sense of self. Now, the point of the meditation techniques is that that's a therapeutic thing for activity, but for the neurosurgeon, let's say, better pay close attention, and maybe we sort of suppress, as it were, the sense of I as a practice, and then, of course, we don't have to think about it. We're just totally focused and doing the right sort of thing. So different choices there, right?
Yeah, so you mentioned these two different kinds of experiences, one where we're aware of us having this conscious experience, and one where we kind of lose track of the fact that there is this I involved in this experience. So, I mean, are these two kinds of experiences fundamentally different, as in one kind of experience, your consciousness is also in a way the object of your consciousness, while in the other one it's not really, or?
So, we need a variety of important distinctions in the forms of consciousness that we're considering. So one of the forms of consciousness is where I'm normally aware of you and we're talking. So there's an awareness of me and awareness of you. But this form of awareness is just built into the experience. So immediate awareness of my own experience is just part of the more or less normal state, okay? But if I want to really focus on what my experience is about, then I have to get myself into a different sort of state. So sometimes meditation does that, but phenomenology is supposed to be a particular technique for refocusing on this consciousness. And I don't even need to say my consciousness at that point, because if I am phenomenologically aware, if I'm reflecting on my own experience in meditation, let's say, or in the neuroscientist's case, right? Then, or a colleague who at Berkeley, who writes about the embodied consciousness, likes he passed away, I'm sorry, he's a good friend of mine. His example was that he especially favored was, there's playing the piano, very complicated, right? You can't be aware of exactly, you better not be aware anymore after you've internalized the practice, or you won't be making the chords as you want them. The other one was a jet fighter pilot. Instantaneous reactions. You have to learn to exactly be precise about that. I just heard an interesting anecdote the other day about a famous Formula One race car driver who would go out and practice, let's say it's, I don't know, Le Mans or something, wherever it is, practice the exact circuit again and again and again, and he'd come back within, almost 1 second of the timing all the way around, and he would catch every curve at the optimal way. So he goes and he does the race, and he's off a little bit and doesn't quite score the way he wanted to, because it turns out that he says, well, someone must have moved the concrete wall at a certain point because I had it down nailed. And it turned out someone had moved the concrete by that much, and he nicked the concrete one himself, and that took off a half second on his. So imagine that you have the kind of awareness like a race car, like a jet pilot, or like a Formula One race car, because they're going how fast? I mean, very fast, right? And they have to be very precise, and then his strategy is to know exactly where all of the curves on the whole course were. And actually the anecdote started by saying and so LeBron James just had a great game, and he was asked, well, what happened at this point? And he kind of looked at the commentator like, aren't you paying attention? And then he rattled off like 15 minutes of exact movement of everyone on the court, exactly, and that's why I missed the shot, Oh, what, don't you know this, right? So imagine the kind of consciousness that you'd have at that point. Now he might have in mind, LeBron James did that because he better have some good ego to do that. But most of the awareness is all of the movement that he's interested in, and the race car driver, the car, exactly. So the embodied consciousness is something that then after Husserl used these distinctions, Merleau-Ponty, the French phenomenologist 50 years later came along and said, let's talk about action and how the whole world is a phenomenal field, as he called it. And what's the central part of the phenomenal field? Well, my living body. And then my experience of everything is through that living body in called a phenomenal field, just the world as I meet it around me, right? So where's the self? Back to these questions. Well, what did you want to know? You want to know what's the experience, what it's like for me to be the self, moving around in the world? That's one thing. What it's like for me to have an experience? What must it be like for a philosopher or an artist to have in mind, I'm doing this kind of work? So Monet is painting the gardens and getting it exactly right. What's his experience like? He's actually kind of trying to record some of it now in painting instead of words, right? And a psychologist is going to be able to be trying to say, and now it always makes me anxious when the camera's on, so what am I going to do about that? Well, let's just focus on the audience instead of on the camera, right? I'll never look at this, so too anxious about what it look like, right? So, where am I? It was meant to be a kind of a pun because I am in my experience, and then in my normal world, here I am moving about in the world, doing all kinds of things. And my consciousness in all of those activities is what phenomenology is about. And the I appears all over the place and sometimes disappears. And that's normal in the sense that it's typical sometimes.
Quantum physics.
Well, if we're doing quantum physics, and actually quantum physics is going to say everything's going to pop in and out anyway, so why wouldn't myself be like that too, right? Who's next?
Any other questions?
Of course.
I don't really know much at all about Husserl, but what do you think in his system he sort of places affectivity sort of in parallel with Heidegger's sort of care and that kind of way in which there's not only intending but this sort of relationship between that success or use and that kind of.
So subsequent phenomenologists kind of take over the basic structures and, again, trying to bring out in their own way, often Heidegger in particular, inventing a kind of his own kind of total language about experience. And instead of experience is Dasein, the forms of being that I have. And so part of our interactivity with others is what Husserl called intersubjectivity. And empathy is part of our affective way of dealing with others. And the other part of affect is our emotions and feelings. And then Heidegger is going to emphasize mood in particular. I think that's an interesting feature. Angst comes in as from Kierkegaard and through Heidegger into a particular kind of attitude. And what do you want to do about your generalized angst about the world? Well, that's either what therapy is about or what phenomenological reflection is about. It's the way we are. So feeling states are part of forms of experience with or without the word consciousness. So Heidegger wanted to change it to our ways of being, but that's right. It is our ways of being, and we are conscious in our ways of being, and we are doing things with affect and with care in the background and so on. So phenomenology is about forms of life and being and experience, and we float around in different terminologies, and the classical phenomenologists in that European tradition talk that way, and now I'm starting to learn about the classical Indian traditions of philosophy. So there's going to be a lot of phenomenological work that requires a lot of translation. So, like that. But we are all human, and these forms of experience are, they evolve and develop, and so we're trying to, different phenomenologists by any other name, and artists and so on are always trying to bring out the ways in which we experience different things. So that's perfectly appropriate.
Any more?
When you were talking about the experiences of no self and the pure I kind of dropping away or receding, even before that you talked about the pure I as being something of a locus of experience. So there's still the sense that whatever the experience is, even if we're not really aware of it being us in the moment, if we reflect back on it, it is definitely us who had that experience. So would you say that the feeling of the pure I dropping away is really the pure I like kind of leaving in some sense, or is it merely that we don't have the attention to recognize it?
Well, I think we need to practice phenomenology to describe these different levels or types of awareness where there is more or less of a sense of I. So the reason that I brought in embodiment, and which Husserl's notion was the lived body as opposed to the physical body, brings in the locus of how I experience the world. And you don't say I, much less David Woodruff Smith, whatever it is, if that's my name, right? See, I is more important than any of the other stuff. I is a localizing feature of experience. And the feature of my lived embodied experience is just, it's centered in a certain way, right? So, with or without the subject I, there may still be a centering of experience, which may be a sort of kernel of one type of I as subject. But in the meditative experience, there's still this feeling of spatial orientation about here. And if you're following that, it's the simple classical technique of breath work, as they say, deep breathing. You're paying attention to the breath, and there's something there. Now that doesn't have to be the self. In fact, the self gets us in trouble because suddenly we start jumping all over the place in our total picture, right? So what we're really looking for is different forms of consciousness. And those different forms of consciousness sometimes have forms of self. Sometimes they have such a simple form as centeredness, right? I mean, if it's visual, if it's auditory, if it's tactile, it's centered. So you kind of want to think, can we put the phenomenology together with what we can learn from developmental psychology? When does a developing child develop more of a sense of what? And don't call it self yet, because that comes along rather later. So the twos are supposed to be a narcissistic phase where everything is centered, but yeah, I'm starting to learn the word I, but I don't, it's all me, right? That's the parody at any rate. So different forms of experience are just natural to describe and analyze, and that's what phenomenology is all about. Where there arise forms of I consciousness, or forms, rather instead of consciousness as if of I or me, it's forms of consciousness that are I see, I think, I feel. I am centered. Even if the I is just the centering of spatiality around me and motion around me, as I'm moving right here, as I'm speaking that way, I'm really not thinking of myself at all. I am the subject, the one that's doing it. And that centering of the activity is all that's required for a certain minimal sense of the pure I, right? So it doesn't get a whole lot of fancy stuff going until, well, you're doing more fancy things. And then if some of those things are reflection in phenomenology and psychology and just conversation, well, then how do you feel about it? Well, I felt about it this way. Well, what were you thinking? Well, I was thinking this. Even as we start to move back and forth, the sense of self as just the subject or the center of it, of the activity, is all that's required for the pure I, right? But as we go about life, yeah, then we start piling on a lot of extra stuff onto the pure I, and that's when I become what we call the self professor or whatever, right? Yeah. Good.
I'm sorry to just be interested in this centering, but with this, I'm curious how Husserl describes this kind of centering in the sense that there's really concepts of one's orientation within space, or with Samuel Toad's sort of concept of balance along the vertical plane as a sort of centering as moving through the horizontal plane. Does Husserl have that kind of concept too already?
Well, yeah, that's coming. His name is Otis from Harvard back in the day. He died too young. It's too bad too. But he was a fan or a follower, as it were, of Merleau-Ponty, who emphasized the embodiment. Merleau-Ponty had access to Husserl's early texts about embodiment, and then went with it and developed this wonderful picture. And then Otis worked very much on he was a friend of Dreyfus, the other person that I mentioned, and they were emphasizing the activities, the actions, as opposed to the sort of purely rational thinking that you might think, well, Descartes was just pure rational. Well, actually, he was pretty active in the world, so he knew more of that than that. So amongst the sort of, I call them the classical phenomenological theorists, then there's this kind of progression. There are two nice phrases that Husserl used. These were in texts that were not published in his lifetime, but Merleau-Ponty saw them and developed his own analysis of them, which is beautiful, a great way to get started on reading phenomenology, Merleau-Ponty. And he also leads into political and social and even sexual activities, so you get the real thing. He's French, right? Of course. So, two phrases that Husserl used to kick off the discussion are, well, what is the embodied self? Well, two things. A center of spatiality and motion, and a locus of the will is the phrase. So I am here and I am acting, right? Two fundamental features of I, as the pure I begins to get layered on with perception and action, and then emotion and feeling and interactivity and intersubjectivity come along with all of that. So there's these neat structural features that begin to analyze. You couldn't have all the rest without having a sense of center of spatiality and motion. Motility was Ponty's word. But also a sense of action, or the will. So people talk about freedom of the will, big problem. Well, what's the problem? We experience it, right? It's part of our experience that I can choose to do things, and that's the existential motif, like that.
Is it, and I forgot the second part of it, but that centering in relationship to the breath, I see that as being sort of together, or that's something about.
I think that would be an interesting way of looking at it, yeah. With all of our sensory experience, it has this sort of centering on the whole body, actually. You know, when the wind is blowing and you're getting cold, I mean, it's different parts of your body you're aware of, the world changing you around you. And the idea of visual perception, auditory perception, tactile perception, they're all integrated, well, through the brain somehow, but we don't have to talk about the causal origins. Our experience has all of this rich structure in it. And, by the way, awareness of others, and in particular other people, is central from each of those big theorists that I actually talked about, from Husserl. Then Edith Stein was a student of Husserl's who basically kind of helped to crystallize the concept of empathy, so that's interesting. And then come the rest of the other classical theorists, like we say, from Heidegger to Merleau-Ponty, and Sartre and Beauvoir, and then forward. And then philosophy of mind takes over with a much more physicalist orientation. And then sometime by the late 1990s, we got to deal with consciousness. So we're back into the phenomenology, putting, as it were, the physical together with the range of consciousness. But in those structures of consciousness, just like you were starting to say, a center of action, a center of space and motion comes with space and time. A center of time, a center of space, and a center of action, which is my acting, the feeling of the will, as we say. Just part of life is doing something willfully. Not willfully, but willfully, right? So all of that is part of the richer sense of the structuring of consciousness, where this pure I is kind of that locus around which whatever it is building. It's that locus that we're looking at. And that's all the pure I is, that kind of locus. I think, I see, I wish, I feel, onward like that.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, because this was something you kind of touched on in one of the previous answers. Has much been said in the phenomenological tradition about how the process of phenomenological investigation through the bracketing, how that affects mundane experience when you return from that to mundane experience, how that affects the experience of the self and just experience in general beyond just the knowledge that might be gleaned from the investigation itself?
Well, I think the more aware that we become of our experience, the more we become aware of our world and of each other. And like I say, one of the more developed, it takes a while to develop the concepts of other with empathy, and the concept of other, which is now in the popular press, comes out of the phenomenology, the theory of empathy to begin with, right? So intersubjectivity, or just social collective awareness, consciousness, I mean, it wasn't invented by these people, it's explored with a theoretical approach. But as you become more aware of forms of experience, then you're just more aware of the world, what you're dealing with. And one way of that kind of reflective awareness is that, well, you don't have to get so caught up on everything that you got to do before, 12 o'clock tonight, right? It's take in a life, and it's like reflection. Reflection is helpful, and phenomenological reflection is sort of a sort of scientific model in the sense that we're trying to understand different things. But a therapeutic model takes these kind of ideas, and just think of the concepts I was just talking about. Different kinds of therapy are all around us, and they involve reflective awareness. And then the mindfulness tradition that's now popular has arrived, let's put it that way. After a couple thousand years of practice elsewhere, it's arrived. And now the mindfulness tradition that is all around us is really powerful. And again, as you begin to, if you just learn to do a little bit of that mindfulness practice, then notice how things seem a little different when you're doing your work, whatever it is, or play or fun or whatever it is. You're a little bit more aware. So there are different ways of becoming more and more aware of and attuned to our experience, and different purposes for it, right? So a therapeutic purpose is one thing, a sort of scientific purpose is another, but they better go together. They better work together.
But would I be right in saying that that side of it is something that's kind of slipped under the radar in phenomenological writing, or have any of the thinkers that we've been talking about tonight really?
Well, it depends on who you talk to. So I have been around enough to meet a fair number of practitioners of psychotherapy, and they have different flavors. But one of the schools, as it were, that I met some people with who were practicing in San Diego, intersubjectivity was the buzzword. Well, where did it come from? I mean, it came from the phenomenological tradition. And so there are more different kinds of practices in the practical world of psychotherapy. I mean, psychoanalysis, is psychoanalysis really dead? Well, I mean, maybe it morphs over into a kind of phenomenological awareness, different modes of awareness of our experience. So the classical model, I mean, maybe this is a good historical question. Why did Freud develop this technique in that period in Vienna of getting people to sit and listen and talk for a while, and then develop theories about it? Well, interesting. And to some extent, we can't do that anymore anyway. No one will pay for it, basically, right? But I'm just using that as an analysis of the different modes of reflective awareness, and they tend to have real practical consequences. So if it slides under the rug, bring it out. Let's talk about it, let's practice it, let's be aware, right? I mean, that's a kind of phenomenological motif, be aware, right? But of course, it's a lot older than this tradition, as we know, so keep trying to slip that in a little bit, right?
Any more questions?
Of course, there are always more questions.
So true.
I have a
Maybe
couple. I
that's
don't
okay.
want to take up too much time, and I might have. All right, let me see if I have anything that's not too time-consuming. I was thinking, you had mentioned something about how subjectivity presupposes a position, and I saw that recently because I was looking over Merleau-Ponty just slightly, and when we think of like spatiality, we're also technically thinking of temporals, because if we're talking the scientific sense, time and space are one, supposed to be one thing, right? So my question was,
And that's a phenomenological feature. Space and time are just together. Now, the physics, they're stayed together at a mathematical level, but at our everyday consciousness levels of consciousness, yeah. Space and time and motion and action and what we're doing and what we're doing together, it's all one connected whole, yeah. Mhm.
and so I was thinking, this overlaps a little bit. When you think of I, is it possible to have a notion of self without having other subjects present? Because that seems like it wouldn't be coherent, or wouldn't make any, like, I
Well-
don't think you can like have a sincere.
That's a theoretical problem that was really interesting in some of the phenomenological traditions. So Husserl was accused of reversion sort of to purely Cartesian solipsism was the idea. And so he wrestled with that in one book and said, no, that's not the way it's going. But you know, when he wrote that book in 1929 called Cartesian Meditations, he was addressing an audience where Heideggerians had said, you slip back to a Cartesian thing. Of course, I have to say, as I did this morning once again, Descartes is wonderful. We don't have to believe these results. You've got to learn something by working through it, right? So it's always here. Good. So the thing is that if that was 1929, and then around 1900 to 1905, he develops a detailed account of the flow of consciousness in time. Along with that, by 1905, 1906, the consciousness of space, and they're going together. By 1907, he's doing this reflective thing of bracket the world, and then comes the emphasis of intersubjectivity. Why, after bracketing the world, does the sense of self and other come into the picture? But he's already, by 1910, working in reaction to the early foundations of psychology, where awareness of others was central. And it's after that, it's after that Heidegger picks up the same theme, being as being with others. Well, that's what Husserl had described as consciousness is intersubjective. And then at that time, when he talked about the awareness of self and body, this is these earlier works, by 1912 he actually was writing about this. And the other people who were criticizing later didn't know that and didn't read these. So what does he say there? Well, which is more fundamental, the sense of I or the sense of the other? And he says it goes both ways.
Same with
So I learn to be an I from you. And I learn then to move back and forth between the perspectives of I and thou, to speak of another text of a few years later, right? I and thou was another. The concept of self and other was going around for very important reasons, right? So the sense of I comes along with the sense of you and the sense of we. And if you think of, again, of developmental psychology, that's an empirical fact of how we develop the sense of I. But that's before the phenomenology. That's the grounds which make possible the causal origins of the experience. But the experience of phenomenology, it's the phenomenological. The phenomenology characterizes the flow of experience, and in the flow of experience, self and other are just among our most basic modes of awareness. And then what I think is really interesting are the tantalizing places where Husserl already says the sense of other is first, and the sense of self, of I, comes after that. So we wanted to think that the sense of self projects from I with this center to the other. But it's equally as important, maybe more important, that it starts with the other and comes in to the self. And the way I like to see it is everything is interdependent. So the sense of I and you and we are all interactive. And by the way, interactive with this, the things around us. This raven, he's coming back, I know, right? He's one of us too, right? So we're all in this, and the trees, and yes, we're tree huggers, we should be too. So the world is for hugging, right? For all of us being in it together.
I quote
Right?
that. Well, one last one, I'll load a question.
How many questions would you like to entertain?
I'm fair game for how many questions you can come up with.
Aw,
It's
that's
just
so
everybody's jumping into the conversation. We're intersubjectively thinking.
Oh, I just had the question in my head.
Kind
Sure.
of a historical question. Do you think, this is something I've kind of come up recently, kind of why I've become interested in Husserl, is just realizing that he's kind of been maybe given shortchanged a little bit by historically and Heideggerians and all
Yeah.
that. But do you
In
think
some circles, indeed, yeah.
And I think there was a little bit of seems to be kind of a disappointment by him that his students didn't sort of stay in his family or something like that, and kind of did their own things.
And you kind of think, you have to think of a little bit of the historical context.
Yeah, maybe more and everything. But do you think, all that aside, between Husserl and Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty and some other big Shaler and
Mhm. Yeah,
do you think there's any real sort of contradictions or real big incongruities between those systems?
Well, as a sort of intellectual theory of how things change, there's this metaphor that people have used, which is that the big thinkers each had to kill off the father to move on. Father, mother, whatever you see, right? And some of that happens, and it's just, it bothers me because I guess I grew up in the sciences first. You don't kill off this and replace it with something. You move along and build and widen our experience. And that's exactly what, when Husserl reads Heidegger, he writes in his footnotes, well, this is what I said on such and such a place, right? And Heidegger could have said, and now I'm going to try to give my own articulation, and he's got his own sort of poetic ways of writing that he wants to work with, and he tells you these interesting ways. But that's not to throw out the other stuff that came before. It's to build and change and move and grow from there. Merleau-Ponty is, in fact, very different from Heidegger in that way. He's generous. He's always taking in the others, making it his own, and changing things to move things along. And Sartre is his own thing, and so on. And yeah, so I think that since we're not in the game of either the literally political worlds in which they were writing, or the academic political worlds that they were writing, we can pick the best ideas wherever we find them, and we should read a lot of different, and study and think about a lot of different things. And that's also interesting why it's important that we begin to bring in phenomenological experiences and reflections from other parts of the world as we begin to get, as the world grows smaller and smaller, we learn more about how much experience we can learn from other places than some of these giant thinkers. But they are great thinkers. And yeah, I think the way in which we should read these thinkers is learn what you got, move it along, and we are. It's happening, right? So yeah, that's interesting.
I have my last question.
You remembered your last
yeah,
question.
got it. All right, this is something I'm always wrestling with, and I was reading over something for a friend of mine, and I was trying to help them understand how, I think it was feminist lens with Simone Beauvoir,
Yeah,
and her perspective versus Merleau-Ponty, and I think she was like giving a critique or something on him, and the main question I got out of that was driving me crazy was they seem to disagree on whether a subject can also be an object, and that's something I see like I think is a intense subject of debate, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I keep trying to get across to people, like, so I was just at a couple of conferences a couple of weeks ago, and one of them was a good number of young scholars were applying phenomenological issues specifically to gender issues, racial issues, gender issues, all at the same time. One of them was incarceration issues. That was scary to think about. So applying the phenomenological method to what are the forms of experience that people are looking at. So here's the sense, the pure self. Now you start adding on the forms of experience for different peoples in different groups. And it's a powerful tool. But I keep trying to tell people the concept of the other, which is so popular now, where did it come from? And they try to tell me it came from Hegel in the 19th century. And I want to say, well, wait a minute, didn't you read The Second Sex? Right? Woman as other to man. So that issue of misogyny really is misperceiving the other self as an object. But you can also make yourself an object. So liberating the idea of that the subject is an object, I mean, officially the object is outside the brackets, but no, that's back to we reflect and then we go back in the world and we think, but these objects have consciousness. And so that's when we bring back in a powerful phenomenological tool. What am I, then what is the other, then what are we? And we put those structures together. Well, Sartre and Beauvoir were working at it. They didn't get everything perfect if you read their biographies, right?
Yeah.
But powerful thinking. And I think the fact that it was The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir that put the notion of the other out there as this powerful social, psychological, political tool of analysis. It's just powerful, right? And where does it come from? It comes from, where am I? In exactly this sense. I'm the subject of different kinds of experience. When we look at the range of experience, then we begin to understand the world in a completely different way. And that's really crucial. So it was really thrilling to see a bunch of different people talking about the most pressing kind of social problems that are around us using very particular phenomenological tools. And one will draw from Husserl, one will draw from Heidegger, one will draw from Beauvoir, one from Merleau-Ponty. Those are the classical. They're important because they wrote a lot and it's very evocative. So I think Merleau-Ponty is, I call him an impressionist with a capital I. It's in the same era of the impressionist painters. But there's something about the way that he's writing. Of course, he's not the first to write impressionistically that bring out what humanity is or what our experience is all about. I mean, that's as long as people have been writing and thinking and talking about it, right? So that tool of I and other I and we together is one of the most powerful things to come out of phenomenology or out of human culture, but this phenomenological reflection on those forms of awareness changes everything. And then back to, well, if we bring that back into the world with us, things can actually change.
More questions? This one,
Someone is thinking alive. Must have something to say.
Yeah, I was just thinking, well,
See, notice that quick empathy. I could see their wheels, the wheels were turning, right?
I was just thinking about the transcendental and, you know, this kind of hyper-empiricism or return to the things themselves. Would it be a form of metaphysics or not? Because the previous answer that you gave about the principles of psychology and William James. So is the bracketing, the pure I, like transcendental phenomenology? I'm just interested.
Yeah.
Is it a form of metaphysics?
Well, so after Kant and before, metaphysics became a suspicious word, not only for this, what became a phenomenological tradition, but what became the tradition of analytic logical philosophy from the Vienna Circle. So metaphysics was supposed to be about speculation beyond the reach of experience, okay? So the transcendental method, which the term comes from Kant, and then is taken up by Husserl, which means, in effect, for Husserl, the bracketing is a technique to focus on the forms of consciousness. So transcendental is a fancy word that then fits, well, it's to focus on consciousness. Now, I think there's nothing wrong with metaphysics because we get at metaphysics through our experience. And that's actually a hot topic in metametaphysics. Have you heard that word yet? Metametaphysics is where people argue about whether you can do metaphysics just out of the blue or whether you do metaphysics through our experience. And I say, yeah, I'm with a phenomenological approach which goes to the world through experience. So I've got no problem with metaphysics that way. But each of a whole lot of thinkers, from Hume to Kant and to Carnap in the logical tradition, and perhaps a bit of Wittgenstein here and there, and nowadays you kind of take your pick. But in this phenomenological tradition, then, certain of the thinkers set up metaphysics as a certain model of something which had to be overcome, probably by being better connected, I would want to say, by connecting metaphysics better with phenomenology, by any other name. That's the way I like to put it, right? So, but I was just at 2 conferences where the question of what was metaphysics came after. One title was Phenomenology, Ontology, Metaphysics, and that was exactly the issue. Start with the phenomenology. How does it relate to ontology, the way the world is? Is there something beyond that's not, what is the metaphysics that's good or bad? So, trick question about what the word metaphysics means, right? That's the way I take it. So of course we have to get at the world, the ultimate structures of the world, through our own experience.